Danny hunched down behind the crumbling brickwork of a rotting warehouse and clutched his long gun to his chest. He cursed Lady Luck under his breath as he rolled a few paces to his left and chanced to peek through a gap in the wall. The day had started out as normally as the rest of his days had been for the last 3.5 months. The rebel forces of the hegemony of independent systems had finally grown the balls to launch a ground invasion of his homeworld of Dravan 2. It was just his luck that he had been back on a recall rotation for equipment renewal. The war had been dragging on for half a decade now by this point. He was tired of the fighting, tired of the killing, and more than tired of the luck-cursed piss chips that they called rations. If he never had to eat another freeze-dried, pre-prepared spaghetti dinner with extra garlic again, it would be far too soon. His radio buzzed, and he slapped the call button in annoyance. "What is it, Jester?" he asked, using his spotter's nickname instead of his real one. His real name was hard to pronounce, full of "hus" and gurgling, guttural sounds native to his people. In response, a slightly gurgling voice issued, "I've told you 10,000 times it's... never mind." His spotter just sighed. Jester was Slaveth, the scaled aliens looking similar to a humanoid shark or deep-sea fish, minus the tail. His soulless black eyes always making him look more than a little ominous to Danny's eyes. Jester spoke again. "Reports of sniper fire to our 264. They moved again, it seems." Danny swore again and slammed a gloved fist into the gritty floor next to him. That son of a bitch. He'd caught just glimpses of his enemy an hour ago while the sun was high overhead. The long carapaced body of a Vinophelian. Unmistakable. The large insectoid species looking like somebody had taken an earthly centipede from some children's nightmare and scaled it up into a 6-meter, 300-kilogram carapace-armoured monster. He had started the day off well enough. The view through his SR-404's scope had been the same as the last month of fighting. Small flashes of enemy troops turning into puffs of viscera when the large caliber bullets he was firing tore through them. There were those that unironically called him the Dark Hand, a name that he secretly hated. He wasn't raised to be a killer. He had actually wanted to be a baker as a child, but trouble had landed him in a juvenile detention centre, and his quick-to-anger nature had seen him enrolled in the military as he turned 18, a path that he'd been stuck in for the last 27 years. Every time he had felt he was close to getting out, he was called back to service. Another bad guy, another conflict. And now, war on a scale never before seen in the sapient Congressional Union's 775 years of history. He nodded to himself, the thoughts of his past flashing away. He had a job to do, and he was obligated to do it in service to the Union. Danny crouched and snapped his heavy gun up onto the low, windowless wall he'd been sheltering behind. He took a moment to see if any fire was directed his way, and then put his eye to the scope. As soon as he did, his anxiety seemed to melt away. The sounds of carnage and gunfire slowly faded as he entered a state of mind that he liked to call his serenity state. It was where he was most comfortable. The decades spent in the service to the Union as a marksman of unparalleled capacity meant he was more comfortable behind the scope than in his own bed. He took a moment to scan the nearer roof and dark-shadowed windows of the bombed-out apartment complex across the thoroughfare. The town was not the largest, but it was not small either. Before its evacuation, it must have had a population in the 10 or 15,000 range. All gone now. Those that had failed to flee had been buried in the rubble of the war as it ground everything it touched to ash and rubble and cratered ruins. He had often heard tell that war was won by attrition. The side with the ability to sling the most men and munitions took the victory. But he liked to disagree. Wars were won by morale, and it was his job to be a constant morale drain for his enemies. Them just knowing he was on the battlefield had proven enough to turn the tides of small-scale battles in his own biased opinion. There, he thought suddenly, a small glint winking at him from a far building immediately drew his attention. Was it his opponent? It could be, but it seemed an unlikely place for them to sit. The building was far too isolated to make good cover. He wouldn't have fired a shot from such a disadvantageous position. But then again, maybe his counterpart was not as versed in the art of hunting as he. He immediately dismissed this explanation. No, his opponent was every bit as good as he himself. In fact, he had heard whispers that it was the legendary Blue Devil himself, the hegemony sniper gaining almost as storied a reputation as his. Though the last he had heard, the Blue Devil was taking heads on New Yimia. That was far to the galactic west, nearly 900 light-years from the Dravan system. Whatever the case, he needed to focus. He refined his scope's zoom and looked closer. The figure he saw didn't look like a Vinifelian. Instead, he could make out a faint trace of pink on a somewhat lanky figure. A Nerevith, then. Danny adjusted his shot for windage and fired, the 220-meter shot child's play for his skills. As he had expected, his shot was true, the distant figure jerking as a small cloud of blue erupted from their torso, before they dropped like a sack of flour. He was about to search for another shot, when the short hairs on the back of his neck seemed to stand on end. He threw himself to the side, and it was lucky he did so, as not a millisecond later, a brilliant blue bolt crashed through the space his head had only just vacated. He rolled to the right as the distant crack of the shot was heard, part of his mind noting the disparity of 2.8 seconds. In Dravan 2's atmosphere, that was nearly exactly 1 kilometre from his position. Judging by the direction the sound had come from, he now had a clearer picture in his mind of where the shot had come from. He'd been able to recognise the sound of his opponent's gun after the second hour of their duel. It sounded like a modified Spectre II electromagnetic sniper, the Vinifelian counterpart to his trusty chemical firearm, although much more potent. The main issue with the weapons was the fact that they were so remarkably heavy. Most species in the Union couldn't even heft them reliably. The Vinarfel were known for their strength, however, and the fact that they had 10 arms helped at least a little bit. As he continued to crawl to a new position, he lamented his choice of position. The barren floor of the building was littered in broken glass and reef glider droppings. Why couldn't he ever fight in a clean carpeted house with lights and a refrigerator full of ironade? He scooched into the shadow of a nearby pillar and sat to wait for a minute. As he did so, his radio buzzed again. He answered it, and almost immediately spoke reassuringly. "Yes, Jester, I'm fine. I know where the shot came from, but I don't have a good spot to take a counter shot from. I need a distraction." The pause, followed by a small sigh, greeted him. The slightly gurgling voice of his spotter fizzed through the poor connection. "That's good news. I was going to tell you that I saw their shot. They might be a quick pop of a slurge, but that gun of theirs makes far too obvious a contrail of ionized air, making it easy to pinpoint their last firing location." Danny smiled at his friend's reply. It was true. His gun might be considered many hundreds of years behind in raw technological development, but it had something that he valued. Unlike a laser, plasma bolt, or electromag projectile, his own bullets travelled through the air with no tell at all, virtually invisible in comparison to more high-tech options. Sure, the muzzle flash of his gigantic sniper was a problem, but he had a flash suppressor equipped to mitigate that as much as possible. No. His real problem was the fact that his human reflexes were no match for the lightning-quick movements of his opponent. He wouldn't win this duel with speed or skill. He would have to rely on his years of experience to outwit his opponent, get them to make a mistake. He looked around. He smiled as he spotted a large piece of glass, and an idea started to form in his mind. He lunged for it and scrambled back to the cover of the wall. He wasn't sure how much of an elevation advantage his opponent had on him, and had to assume they could see down into the room he was in. He carefully set the piece of glass up at an angle on the wall next to the pillar he was on. He made sure to angle it towards the suspected location of his opponent, his EV HUD goggles allowing him to see what Jester saw in real time. Using this information, he moved a half-dozen meters to the side and pulled out a handheld laser rangefinder from his belt. Setting his gun up against the wall in a ready position, he shined the laser on the glass, hoping his plan would work the way he intended. Almost a second later, he jerked as a white-hot streak smashed the pane into glass dust. Without hesitation, he bolted upright and sighted on the place that Jester had just seen the flash from. It was a large 6-story building nearly 980 meters away, far behind the front line. He took only the barest moment to calculate bullet drop and crosswind before firing. He wanted to watch the shot, but he knew in his heart that it was a mistake. His hesitation would cost him though, as another brilliant streak would reach out towards him from that distant tower, his opponent already firing on him before his shot had even crossed the gap. Danny managed to jump aside, but his gun was not so lucky. The bulky SR-404 was smashed to pieces by the incredible power of his enemy's weapon. Danny hit the ground painfully. He could feel shrapnel embedded in his chest rig and shoulder, but nothing felt crucial. Instead, he watched a replay of the feed from Jester's point of view. He saw the tiny pinprick of his enemy as they fired, and then smiled as a moment later, a puff of red indicated a solid hit. He couldn't be sure if it had been a kill shot though, and instead reached out for his radio while rolling onto his back with a groan. "Jester, I think it's time we take a little break," his spotter just replied stoically.
"If you say so, sir. I'll call for medical right away."
Danny didn't reply. Instead he just smiled. He got the feeling that his opponent had not gotten the best of him, and neither had he.